Hey everybody, I'm back with the little tutorial, some advanced material relating to the use of multiple exposures, typically referred to as bracketed exposures, to capture a greater dynamic range in an image. Typically this relates to landscape photography, but it might be applied to other subject matter. Essentially, your camera has a certain dynamic range. Let's imagine it's this broad from highlight to shadow. But if the scene has a greater dynamic range than that, you're typically faced with either shooting for the shadows or the highlights or the midtones, leaving out detail and highlight and shadow. Or you could take several exposures, one for the shadows, one for the midtones, one for the highlights, and then combine them in Photoshop. The method is typically referred to as HDR photography, high dynamic range, or image stacking. So yeah, I'm going to just run through a couple of examples, and the files that I'm using are available on the Moodle site for you to download if you're curious and want to experiment with the same images. Okay, from the outset, to start with HDR compositing, in Photoshop here you would go to File and Automate, and you'll notice that there's a Merge to HDR Pro option down here. So I'm going to choose that, and then I'm going to browse or navigate to some images that are bracketed. I think I'm going to use, what were they called? The sample of Venice images. So you'll notice there are three images here described as normal, exposure, overexposed, and underexposed. So I'm going to gather those up and choose Open. And here they are loaded into the Merge to HDR dialog box, and I'm going to choose OK. And Photoshop will do its thing. Now, you'll see here, down in the lower left, there are three exposures. They're referenced in regard to EV, or exposure value. So this one is 2 stops. This one here is 2 stops overexposed. This one is the correct exposure, and this one is 2 stops underexposed. And if you look at those closely, you would see that each image has various areas of tonal detail. The underexposed one has greater detail in the highlights, the sky up here. The overexposed one has greater detail in the shadow areas, say over the boat and the water over here. And the correctly exposed one similarly has decent exposure in the midtones, but not so much in the highlights or shadow. So we're going to combine those together. Okay, so your interface will likely default to this mode, 16-bit and local adaptation, which is a good place to start. There's a little button here for removing ghosts, so if anything shifts or moves during the exposure, you would want to remove those ghosts, but it depends on the subject matter, etc., and your exposure as to whether that's helpful. Now, there are various sliders here that you can manipulate to get the aesthetic sensibility that you want. And under presets here, there are also several options. What you might be familiar with in HDR imaging, which has kind of given it a bad rap, is this surrealistic high contrast aesthetic. It gets a little bit crazy. I think something a little more realistic, but also exploiting highlight, shadow, and midtone detail would be what's described as photorealistic here in our presets. So I would choose that. And a way to be considering this is to, as you look at the presets, you'll notice that shifts in these various sliders here in tonal detail, etc., move corresponding to the preset. So that's kind of a way of seeing how the various aesthetics are achieved via these sliders. One thing, for instance, is this edge glow. If you crank it up here starts to give a strange kind of Wizard of Oz look to things, so be cautious about that. However, my preferred way of working with HDR compositing is to go here to the mode selector and choose 32 bits instead. And so now all we're doing is combining these 3 exposures, 2 stops underexposed, correctly exposed, and 2 stops overexposed. And typically that's done with shutter speed rather than aperture. So if the prescribed shutter speed here was a 60th of a second, 2 stops underexposed would be 1/250th of a second, and 2 stops overexposed would be 1/15th of a second. So in describing that, you probably realize that you'd need to use a tripod likely to get this all synced up and in register. But back to the interface here, I'm choosing 32-bit, and when I do that, you'll see my histogram is here. You can essentially move via this slider if mine will move. There we go. An ability to adjust essentially the exposure. But what I find most effective is to click the complete toning in Adobe Camera Raw, which you should be familiar with. That then makes this button become tone in ACR. So I'm going to click that, and then you'll find yourself in a very familiar space here in Adobe Camera Raw. Eventually, with our typical sliders, highlight, shadow, etc. So I'm just going to look at this, zeroing these out initially to the I don't know why my defaults are set that way, but yeah, zeroed out there. First thing I'm going to do would be adjust my main exposure here. I will pull back my highlights, so that's going to bring up some of that detail in the sky there. Maybe I'll bring my exposure down a little bit more. I'm going to open up my shadows, and then I'm going to set my white point right before it clips. My black point, I guess I'll open that entirely up. And then of course clarity can be tweaked here. And I'm also, of course I would go through a tone curve, probably medium contrast, sharpening, etc., which you're used to. But under here, the FX tab here, something that I haven't really presented so much to you. This is where we set the post-crop vignette. There's a little slider up here for dehaze, and this is pretty miraculous, adjusting mid-tone contrast. You can crank this left, typically adding more mid-tone contrast, and you'll get a really kind of crisp aesthetic in the image. So there we are. We have shadow detail, highlight detail, mid-tone detail via the combination of 3 exposures on a tripod using shutter speed to adjust the exposure, maintaining the same aperture throughout, because you wouldn't want to shift the depth of field from exposure to exposure. Okay, so I'm going to hit cancel here, and I'm going to show you one other method to use. So now I'm going to go File, Open, navigating to, again, these images are available for you to download from Moodle, the sample lighthouse. There are 3 exposures here. You see, if I make this a little bit bigger, this exposure is the normal one, the camera suggested. This is overexposed, so the sky is blown out, but you get much more detail here in these rocks. And then if we go to the underexposed image, you'll see while the shadow areas are totally blocked now, there's a whole lot more detail in the sky, more detail even than in the normal exposure. So for this example, I'm going to open all 3 of these simultaneously. So here they are in 3 tabs, and then I'm going to combine them into a single image. So easy way to do that is to grab your Move tool. It's the top tool in your tool palette. Also the V key is how you select that. And I'm just going to click in the image area of the normal exposure, drag it up to, combine these in the overexposure one, it doesn't really matter. Drag it up until the overexposure tab becomes highlighted, and then drag back down into the image area and let go. Now you see this image is out of register, but it will kind of snap into the right place if I drag it back. I'll show you another trick there that makes that even easier. Now I'm going to grab the underexposed image. Similarly, I'm going to drag it up to lighthouse, overexposed, drag down into the image area, and this time if I hold down the shift key when I let go, the image is totally in register. Okay, so here are my 3 images contained within a single image. You notice they've appeared here in 3 layers. I also could have gone to a certain layer, selected all, Command A, copied it, Command C, and then pasted it, Command V, into the next document, which would have placed the pasted imagery into another layer. If there's ever an issue in which you've conceivably shot handheld and the images aren't lining up together, a little trick is to select all your layers, like I have them here, and then go to Edit, and there's an option in here, Auto Aligned Layers. So I'm just going to choose that option. I'm just going to choose Auto there as well. Vignette removal, geometric distortion removal, if that's an issue, can be enabled, but I'll just hit OK. And there's probably not a lot of alignment that needs to be applied here. It looks like maybe it shifted things slightly, so that's good. Okay, so from here, what we're interested in, of course, is using the best elements from this image, which seems to be the bright highlights of the building and the rocks, the best elements from this exposure, which might be essentially the midtones, and then the best elements from this exposure, which happen to be the sky detail here. It's all pretty easy to do. I'm going to use this layer, layer 1, which is my correct, in theory, exposure, and I'm going to put it on the bottom by just dragging it down. And then looking at this layer here, which is the overexposed one with the blown out sky, I'm just going to create a mask for it. So I'm going to click on the Make a Mask button right there. White is making the entire thing visible. You should be comfortable by now inverting this, Command I. Now it's a black mask, entirely black. If you option click on it, you can see that, which is hiding everything in the image area. And I'm simply going to get my brush tool, B key. Highlight the foreground color will be white. I have a pretty low opacity and a brush that's hardness is set to 0. So really soft edge brush. I'm going to change the scale, using my left bracket key. And then I'm just going to paint essentially visibility or opacity on the areas of this layer here that I want to include, the rocks, maybe some of the house. Okay, so I'll change the size of my brush on the fly, but I'm just going to bring up some of these highlights here in the image. Okay, pretty simple. So you can see as I turn on and off the visibility of that highlight layer, it's adding a little something to those shadows. And then I'm going to do the same thing, of course, in this image, which is the underexposed one, but has this gorgeous sky. I'm going to give it a mask and invert the mask. Incidentally, if you hold down the Option key when you click the Add a Layer Mask button, it's a black mask instead. So now we don't see what's in this image area. But again, working in the mask with a large soft brush set to a low opacity, I'm just going to start painting in here. What I'm most concerned about are these highlight areas. I'm just going to be painting in anything that I want from this layer that looks nice. So maybe I'll pick up a little bit of this orange glow in the water, and if I option click here, you can see that this stuff is the area that's visible, this is hidden where the lighthouse is, and now essentially I have an exposure that's a combination of pretty correct neutral exposure, some portions of the overexposed image to bring up shadow detail, and some portions of the underexposed image to bring up some of this highlight detail. And essentially we're ready to go. Because I auto-align those, I'm going to want to crop a little bit to remove the offending areas. So crop tool, drag those in, hit OK. And essentially now, here we go. Quite an improvement in a landscape. So think about that when you're out there shooting, and if you can, bracket exposure with a faster shutter speed and a slower shutter speed shooting in manual mode beyond what your camera suggests is the correct exposure, then you can really add some punch to your images. Okay, that's all for now. Give it a try, download those source files, and see what kind of magic you can create.